In the spring of 2014, every coffee shop in Decatur County, Kansas, was telling the same story about worn-out ground. The story sounded different depending on who was speaking. At the elevator it sounded like yield maps and tenancy risk. At the co-op it sounded like low CEC, low organic matter, and too many years of trying to make thin soils carry thick expectations. At the implement dealership it sounded like the kind of shrug men use when they have already moved on from a problem they never intended to solve. But it was the same story all the way through. Some land had simply had too much taken out of it. Too much tillage. Too many hard summers. Too many passes made for appearances instead of endurance. Too many years where every stalk that could have sheltered the soil was treated like trash that needed to be buried. By then people had a phrase for those acres, and they said it with the confidence of people who think naming a thing means understanding it. They called it finished soil. One of those fields sat 3 miles west of Dresden on a quarter section that had passed through enough hands to lose its original name and become known only by its defects. Men called it the West Flat, though it was not flat enough to be easy and not rolling enough to drain gracefully. Its topsoil had thinned on the knolls. The lower stretches sealed after hard rains. In dry years it opened in long pale cracks that looked less like weather and more like judgment. Nothing about it inspired confidence. In a good season it was ordinary. In a difficult one it became an argument against optimism. Local renters had pushed corn on it when prices invited courage, soybeans when rotation demanded hope, and wheat when people wanted one more chance to believe the field could still behave like the county's better acres. The field had disappointed each approach in its own way. It had stopped surprising anybody, which is one of the saddest things that can happen to land. By the time this story begins, the West Flat belonged to a farmer named Warren Hayes. Warren was 66 that year, with a stooped back, a careful walk, and the kind of face prairie weather carves on men who spend more time looking at horizons than at mirrors. He was not dramatic, not charismatic, and not especially interested in persuading people of things they had already decided not to see. He had farmed all his life and looked like he had trusted weather exactly the right amount, which is to say not at all. If you met him in town, you would not have guessed he was carrying a private argument with half the county. He spoke softly. He paused before answering. He let silence sit in the air long enough to make quicker men uneasy. Some people took that for uncertainty. It was not uncertainty. It was a habit built from years of discovering that most farm talk contains too much conclusion and not enough observation. Warren had bought the West Flat at the wrong time and for the right reason. In 2008, when land values still let men justify dangerous thoughts to themselves, the quarter had come available through an estate. Younger operators with stronger balance sheets looked at it, ran numbers, and backed away. The field was too inconsistent, too tired, too easy to overpay for and too hard to defend if a banker ever asked hard questions. Warren bought it anyway, not because he thought it was a hidden jewel, but because he had driven past it for nearly 40 years and could not stand the thought of another decade of careless farming finishing off what bad management had started. That is not the sort of reason lenders like hearing. It sounds sentimental. But Warren was not sentimental. He was practical in a deeper way than most spreadsheets recognize. He believed land can be nursed back if somebody quits treating it like a machine that only responds to pressure. For the first 3 years after he bought the field, nothing he did produced any evidence dramatic enough to impress the county. That mattered, because farm country respects rescue stories only after the rescue is visible. Before then, it mostly calls them mistakes. Warren cut tillage. He left residue standing where other men would have worked the field black for the sake of spring pride. He brought in poultry litter on a year when his neighbors said that if a field needed that much help it probably needed a new owner instead. He seeded cereal rye after wheat and again ahead of soybeans where the timing allowed. He accepted ugly early springs in exchange for quieter summers. He put in contour strips on sections where runoff had a habit of making private decisions about where the topsoil ought to live. He learned which low areas sealed first, which ridges dried into powder fastest, and which headlands had been compacted into stubbornness by 20 years of traffic nobody had bothered to think about. It was slow work, unglamorous work, and the kind of work people rarely honor because it produces more patience than spectacle. In town they laughed at him politely. Not all at once. Not cruelly. Farm country is often too well-mannered for open cruelty and too proud to admit how much it enjoys small failures. But the laughter was there, tucked inside comments that sounded harmless if you repeated them to outsiders. Warren's neighbor, Clay Bender, once said at the co-op that Warren was trying to grow a forest floor in wheat country. A crop consultant named Rick Sollers told somebody over coffee that the old man was farming residue instead of crops. Another operator, younger and cleaner and always wearing shirts with seed company logos stitched over the pocket, said the West Flat was done before Warren bought it and would still be done after Warren got tired of pretending otherwise. That line traveled because it sounded efficient, and county gossip loves an efficient insult. Warren heard most of it eventually. He never answered any of it directly. He simply kept notes. That was one of his habits. In the breast pocket of his work shirt, or sometimes in the glove box of a pickup that smelled like baler twine and dust, he carried narrow spiral notebooks with dates, rainfall amounts, field observations, planting depths, emergence notes, shovel tests, infiltration guesses, and little maps no one but him could have read without explanation. He had been doing that since 1981. Not because he was quaint. Because he had discovered long ago that memory flatters or punishes a season depending on how the harvest went, and if you want the truth you had better write it down before the market speaks. In those notebooks the West Flat was not a dead field. It was a list of physical facts waiting for enough years to reveal a pattern. The spring of 2014 arrived dry enough to make optimism feel slightly irresponsible. Winter moisture had been uneven. March winds took more than they gave. By April, dust was already moving across open ground in certain afternoons. The county did what counties always do when conditions start uncertain and prices are still whispering temptation. It doubled down on the visible things. More fertilizer. Faster planting windows. Cleaner starts. Men wanted black soil warming early, planters rolling hard, rows neat enough to reassure themselves that management was in control even if the weather refused to cooperate. Warren did not argue with any of it. He planted the rest of his farm according to common sense and timing, but on the West Flat he stayed with the system he had been building. He terminated the rye later than Clay Bender said was sane. He left a mat on the surface that made the field look half-finished to anybody driving by. He accepted the muttering. He had accepted worse. Rick Sollers came out in May with a local landlord who was considering a lease on another Hayes field. Rick liked visiting farms with landlords because it allowed him to perform confidence in front of people who did not know enough to challenge the polished parts. He walked the edge of the West Flat, nudged residue with his boot, and said in that smooth advisory tone that never quite conceals contempt that Warren was making a moisture problem worse. This kind of ground needs heat and air, he said. Not a blanket. Warren looked out across the field and answered, it's had heat and air for 20 years. That's part of how it got this way. The landlord laughed because he did not want to be caught choosing sides in a conversation he did not understand. Rick smiled. He had the smile of a man who considered disagreement from older farmers one of the routine inconveniences of modern agriculture. Then he walked back to his pickup and left the field with exactly the same opinion he brought to it. June stayed hotter than the county liked. There were scattered rains, enough to keep hope moving, but not enough to settle the argument. On better acres corn came on cleanly. Soybeans held color. The rougher patches across the county began showing stress earlier than anyone wanted to discuss openly. The West Flat looked odd. Not bad, exactly. Just odd. The residue kept the ground darker and cooler. Emergence was not as visually flashy as some neighboring fields planted into cleaner, warmer seedbeds. Clay Bender drove past one evening, slowed his pickup at the corner, and later told 3 different people that Warren's field looked like it wanted to be a compost pile. It was the kind of line people repeat because it lets them enjoy a joke while pretending they are only making an observation. By the second week of July, the county had entered one of those weather patterns the plains save for years when they want to test what kind of management is merely fashionable and what kind is structural. Day after day the heat rose into the 90s. Wind held through the afternoons. Short chances of rain appeared on forecasts and vanished as if embarrassed to have been mentioned. Lighter ground started giving up first. Corn leaves rolled before noon. Soybeans on tougher knolls turned a hard, defensive green. Road ditches browned. Men stood at the edge of fields in the evenings and said the same hopeful lies counties have always told themselves in dry years. If we catch one. If the next system shifts south. If we can just hold until next week. The West Flat did not look miraculous. That is important. It did not become one of those movie fields people later remember as glowing with unlikely health while everything around it failed. It simply suffered slower. The row middle stayed covered. The soil under the residue held a cooler feel at midday. The low spots that usually crusted into hard plates after one hot rain and then punished roots for the rest of the summer behaved less viciously. Water from the scattered early showers had not vanished as fast as it did on cleaner, more exposed acres. The crops still felt the heat. The leaves still tightened. The field still carried stress. But it did not surrender itself as quickly. Warren saw the difference first with a shovel. That was another one of his habits. He trusted boots and steel before he trusted windshield impressions. One evening around the middle of July, he took a spade and a tape measure and went into the West Flat at 3 different points he had marked in his notebook from years past. He dug in the row, then in the row middle, then along a low stretch where sealing had once reduced a crop to a public embarrassment. The surface was dry, yes. Of course it was dry. But below the first hostile inches the ground held together better than it used to. There was moisture where the field once would have given him nothing but powder. The soil broke in larger, darker aggregates. The roots followed pores instead of stopping at a crust line. Warren wrote 3 sentences in the notebook before going back to the house. He wrote them carefully, because he understood what he was seeing and how unlikely people would find it if they had not seen it with him. 2 days later the heat tightened further. Now, Decatur County had seen worse years. Older men remembered 1988 the way soldiers remember a hard campaign. But memory does not soften present stress. By late July, the county's concern had shifted from yield potential to survivability on some acres. Crop Scout stopped speaking optimistically in public. The co-op quit pretending every problem could be addressed with one more recommendation sheet. And when people began making serious comparisons, one detail became inconveniently hard to ignore. Warren Hayes' supposedly finished field was staying in the fight longer than fields people had considered safer. Clay Bender was the first to say it aloud, though not in a way that allowed him to sound impressed. He pulled into Warren's yard one evening and stood by the pickup bed looking toward the west as if he had stopped by on unrelated business. Then he said, "That old quarter of yours is holding color better than I figured." Warren nodded. "Seems to be." Clay kicked at the gravel with one boot. "Could be because it's behind a week." "Could be," Warren said. Clay hated answers that did not let him settle the matter. "You checked it?" "I check all of them." "And?" Warren looked at him long enough to make the younger man regret asking casually. Then he said, "It's got more underneath than it used to." Clay nodded like a man pretending not to hear challenge inside simplicity. Then he changed the subject to wheat basis and left. What he did after leaving was drive past the West Flat again, this time slower. The weather broke in the ugliest possible way. On the first Sunday in August, after nearly 6 weeks of the kind of heat that turns every conversation into a negotiation with the sky, clouds built from the west, and by late afternoon the county finally got what everyone had been begging for. Rain. But not the gentle sort people had pictured while standing in dusty fields. It came hard. A real plains storm. Fast-moving, dark-bellied, and violent in the first 20 minutes. Water fell with enough force to flatten ditch grass and hammer bare spots into submission. Roads ran. Culverts filled. Freshly worked edges lost shape. The kind of rain that can save a crop if the ground can accept it and punish a crop if the ground has forgotten how. By evening the county had begun reporting exactly that divide. On many fields, especially the cleaner tilled ones and the areas where heat had already tightened the surface into a kind of quiet hostility, the rain did what hard summer rain so often does on damaged ground. It hit, sealed, ran, and left. Water gathered in low places, cut channels where it found weakness, and by morning had already vanished from the profile in all the ways that matter least to a plant. The county had gotten rain, but not all of the county had kept it. Men drove out to inspect fields expecting relief and found wash lines, ponding scars, and surfaces crusted in a way that somehow looked both soaked and thirsty. At the West Flat, Warren walked the field at dawn. He did not bring anybody. He did not announce anything. He simply carried his spade, his notebook, and the private caution of a man who knows disappointment can still arrive after years of patient work. The residue was dark and settled. There was standing water only in one place where standing water had always collected and always would unless somebody moved heaven or the county road. But the rest of the field had done something it had not done in a very long time. It had taken the rain. Not perfectly. No field takes a storm perfectly. But it had opened instead of sealed. The water had entered. The row middles were soft without being slick. The surface aggregates held shape. There was no fresh sheet wash on the slopes worth mentioning. Warren drove the shovel in and turned a slice. Moisture had moved down. He stood there with the soil opened in front of him and felt, not triumph, but the heavier thing that comes before triumph in men like him. Vindication. Slow, practical vindication. The kind built from years nobody notices. By midday the news had begun moving. Clay Bender, who had expected the West Flat to show the same wash patterns as his own cleaner field, stopped along the fence and stared for a long while before going home. Rick Sollers came out 2 days later because a landlord with acres nearby had heard a rumor he did not quite believe. Rick walked in 30 yards, bent, touched the surface, then stepped farther. He asked Warren when the last tillage pass had been. He asked how long the rye had been left standing. He asked whether any gypsum or special soil amendment had been applied. Warren answered each question plainly. Then Rick asked the only honest question left. How much of that rain do you think this field actually kept? Warren said, more than it would have 5 years ago. More than your field across the road, from what I can see. Rick did not answer right away. Then he said, that's a hard thing to admit. Warren nodded. Good thing the field doesn't care. Now the county loves a reversal story, but only once the reversal is far enough along that people can repeat it without feeling implicated. In the weeks after that storm, the West Flat changed status in local conversation. It was no longer Warren's foolish restoration project. It was no longer proof that old farmers sometimes mistake residue for strategy. It became an object lesson, though counties prefer not to use such formal language. Men said things like, that Hayes quarter took the rain better than anything around it. They said, maybe there's more to all that trash than I figured. They said, funny how that ground was supposed to be dead. The jokes did not disappear entirely. Rural pride hates a full retreat. But the tone changed. The laughter lost confidence. The crop responded too. Again, not spectacularly. That was never the nature of this field. The rain did not convert the West Flat into some runaway county champion. But it gave the crop exactly what Warren had spent 6 years preparing the soil to do with a storm when one finally arrived. It gave it usable water instead of theatrical water. The plants stood differently 3 days later. The leaves loosened. The lower ground recovered without the usual punishment. The stressed ridges stayed stressed, because weak acres are not magically transformed by one event. But even there the field now carried moisture deeper into August than the county had ever seen from that quarter in recent memory. What looked from the road like a decent save became, by September, a pattern that no one could deny. Warren's field had not been the healthiest before the rain. It had been the most capable of using it. That distinction is where the whole story lives. Anybody can admire a good field in a good year. That requires no intelligence. The test is whether a field under pressure still remembers how to behave like soil when the chance finally comes. Finished soil does not drink rain. Finished soil panics. It seals. It sheds. It gives you runoff, flash response, and the illusion of rescue without the substance. The West Flat had once been like that. That is why Warren never argued with the county's description of what it used to be. He simply rejected the certainty that it had to remain so. At harvest the combine turned rumor into numbers. The county had endured a strange year. Some fields that looked tremendous in June disappointed after the heat and the badly used August rain. Some poorer fields ended up a little better than feared where later showers aligned. The West Flat came in solid. More than solid, really, if you compared it honestly to what that quarter had been and what neighboring ground of similar quality had done. Warren had historical notes going back to the estate sale year. He knew exactly what sort of yields the field had given under stress, and what it gave now was not just better. It was different in kind. The low zones no longer collapsed the whole average. The knolls no longer punished every dry spell like a personal betrayal. The field behaved less like a patchwork of excuses and more like a single living system with uneven strengths but shared endurance. Clay Bender asked for the yield number twice because the first time he heard it he assumed Warren had rounded in his own favor. Rick Sollers asked whether Warren had considered grid sampling again to separate how much of the gain was fertility and how much was structure. Warren said, "You can sample whatever you like. I'm not arguing against nutrients. I'm arguing against pretending they're the whole story." That line got repeated too. By winter the county had elevated the West Flat into the sort of local parable that gets retold around coffee and shop heaters once weather has made everyone humble enough to remember. Some told it as a lesson in no-till. Some as a lesson in cover crops. Some as a lesson in organic matter. Some as proof that old men should occasionally be left alone to fix things younger people have already dismissed. All of those contained part of the truth. None contained all of it. The real lesson was slower and harder to sell. Warren Hayes had spent years teaching broken ground to trust water again. There is no invoice dramatic enough to make that look important while it is happening. It matters only when the sky finally tests the work. That winter, the county extension office invited Warren to speak at a soil meeting in Oberlin. He nearly refused. He disliked standing in front of people, disliked being cast as evidence, and distrusted applause when it arrived later than mockery. But his daughter, who taught school in Hayes and had inherited more of his stubbornness than either of them admitted, told him he ought to go because half those men need to hear a field story instead of another presentation with colored bars on a screen. So Warren went. He stood at the front of the meeting room in a clean denim shirt and held one of his little spiral notebooks while men who had laughed at him 2 summers earlier sat in folding chairs pretending not to remember their own lines. Warren did not give them slogans. He did not romanticize cover crops. He did not speak as if soil could be healed by belief. He spoke about surface armor, residue, infiltration, root channels, traffic, sealing, timing, and patience. He spoke about what happens when a field loses structure gradually enough that each year's loss looks normal until a storm exposes the full damage. He spoke about how land that seems finished is often merely abandoned at the level that matters most. Then he held up the notebook and said, "I never wrote down that the field was dead. I only wrote down what it did. After a while, what it did started changing. No one laughed at that. After the meeting, 3 younger operators waited to talk to him. One wanted to know how late he seeded rye. One asked whether residue ever cost him yield in a cold spring. One asked the best question of the evening, which was how he kept going when the first years looked unimpressive. Warren answered each one seriously. To the last, he said, because the field didn't need me to be impressed. It needed time. That is the sort of sentence farm country rarely rewards in the short term. It takes too long. It cannot be sold. It has no bright label. But it was the truth. The West Flat continued improving after 2014, though not in a smooth or sentimental line. There were wet springs that made Warren question every acre of residue he had left. There were dry spells that still punished the weak ridges. There was one year a hailstorm tore enough leaf tissue to make all questions about infiltration feel abstract for a while. The field was still itself. Soil does not become perfect because a man finally earns the right to say "I told you so." But the quarter was no longer discussed as dead ground. It had re-entered the county's imagination as workable land, which may sound like a modest victory until you understand how rarely communities reverse an agricultural verdict once they have pronounced one. Warren never said much about that reversal. If somebody praised the field, he usually shrugged and talked instead about the next season. If somebody asked what product made the difference, he answered in a way that usually disappointed them. Mostly not undoing the same damage every year, he said once. That line was so plain people almost missed how radical it was. Agriculture often celebrates intervention because intervention invoices well and flatters the fantasy that all problems are waiting for stronger action. Warren's whole approach had been different. He had asked what damage the field could stop receiving, then built from there. Less exposure. Less disturbance. More cover. More roots. More time. When the rain finally came, the field responded not to a miracle but to years of reduced insult. There is a reason the story stayed alive in Decatur County long after the harvest was binned and sold. It was not just because people enjoy seeing local opinion corrected. It was because the correction arrived in a form too honest to ignore. A storm had asked a clear question. Which fields could actually use rain? Not celebrate it from the road, not gather it in the ditches, not talk about totals in town, but use it where crops need it. Only one field in that neighborhood answered better than anyone expected, and it was the one the county had already condemned. They said his soil was finished. Then rain finally came and only one field drank it in.